The rain came down like the sky had something to confess. It hammered the hospital parking lot in sheets so thick that the fluorescent lights overhead barely cut through the darkness, growing pale, shaping halos across the wet asphalt. Puddles swallowed the painted lines between parking spaces. A paper cup tumbled across the ground, spinning wildly before the wind flattened it against a concrete pillar. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low and heavy, like a warning that had already come too late. Cha tightened her grip on the umbrella with one hand and kept her other arm locked firmly around Madam Kang's waist, guiding the older woman forward with careful, measured steps. The hospital's automatic doors slid shut behind them, muffling the warm sounds of the lobby, the soft beeping of monitors, the hum of air conditioning, the distant voice of a nurse calling down a corridor. Out here there was nothing but the rain and the dark and the particular kind of silence that exists between two people who have grown genuinely fond of each other. "Careful," Cha said softly, steering Madam Kang around a puddle that had gathered in a dip in the pavement. "The ground is slippery here. Take your time." Madam Kang made a quiet sound of amusement. "You fuss more than my son. Your son doesn't fuss nearly enough." That made the older woman laugh. A real laugh. Warm and unguarded. The kind that belonged to a woman who had once been very happy before life complicated itself. She leaned slightly into Cha-Ah's side, not because she couldn't walk, but because the contact comforted her. Her weekly physiotherapy sessions had been going well. The doctors were encouraged. Madam Kang, however, measured her progress by simpler things. Whether she could button her own blouse in the morning, whether she could lift a teacup without her hand trembling. Tonight she had buttoned her blouse. Tonight was a good night. They moved slowly toward the far end of the parking lot where the car was waiting. The driver had pulled close to the building to shorten their walk in the rain, and his silhouette was visible through the windshield, the amber glow of his phone screen illuminating the lower half of his face. Cha was watching the ground ahead of them, checking for uneven pavement, for anything that might catch the older woman's foot. She was always watching. That was simply who she was. A person whose eyes were permanently trained on the space just ahead of other people, scanning for trouble so they wouldn't have to. She didn't see the black SUV until it was already there. It came in fast and silent, cutting across the entrance of the parking lot with its headlights off. Not the casual silence of someone arriving late to visit a patient. Something mechanical, something deliberate. The vehicle stopped at an angle 20 meters away, half blocking the exit, and for one suspended second nothing happened at all. Then the doors opened. 4 men stepped out. Dark clothing, dark masks. The kind of coordinated, purposeful movement that didn't belong in a hospital parking lot at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. They weren't rushing. That was the detail that pierced through the rain static in Cha-Ah's mind and turned into pure cold fear. They weren't rushing, because rushing implied uncertainty, and these men had none. Madam Kang felt the change in Cha-Ah's body before she understood what was happening. The arm around her waist went rigid. "Nurse Seo." The first shot split the night, like the world cracking open. It hit the concrete column beside them, throwing up a burst of white dust and fragments that stung the air. Cha didn't think. Thinking was slow. Her body simply moved, turning, pulling Madam Kang back, putting herself between the older woman and the direction of the sound. The umbrella hit the ground. The rain immediately soaked through Cha-Ah's white uniform, plastering the fabric cold against her skin. "Get down, get down." Her voice was barely audible over the rain and the noise, but her hands were certain, pressing Madam Kang toward the shelter of a parked car. Another shot. Closer. The side mirror of the car beside them exploded. Madam Kang was crying out something. A name, the same name, over and over, but the rain swallowed the sound before it could carry. Cha turned. She saw the third gunman raising his weapon. She saw that it was aimed past her, at Madam Kang, crouched against the car door, too exposed, too visible despite everything. Later, she would not be able to explain it. There was no calculation, no bravery in the conscious, deliberate sense of the word. There was only the clear and absolute impossibility of stepping aside. So she didn't. She moved forward instead, arms spreading, body pivoting, placing herself directly in the path of whatever was coming. The bullet found her left side, just below her shoulder. The impact was not what films prepared you for. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a force, enormous, dislocating, like being struck by something moving too fast for the world to properly account for. She staggered. Her back met the car. She had time to register one strange, clear thought. This is going to make everything very difficult. Before her legs decided they were finished and the wet asphalt came up to meet her. She heard tires. Multiple vehicles. Shouting. Different voices now, not the cold, coordinated voices of the masked men, but something louder and angrier and somehow more dangerous. She heard Madam Kang screaming her name. And then she heard nothing at all. Kang Min-Jae stepped out of his car into the rain, still moving, one hand already raised in a signal to his men that required no translation. They spread instantly, flanking, weapons drawn, and within 40 seconds the parking lot had been remade into something else entirely. A battlefield, a perimeter, a declaration. He saw the masked men running. He saw his mother crouched beside a car, alive, trembling, her hands pressed over her mouth. And then he saw the white uniform soaked red. He stopped walking. In 20 years of the life he had chosen, Kang Min-Jae had never once stopped walking toward danger. Not when knives were drawn. Not when guns were raised. Not when every rational calculation screamed retreat. He had always kept moving, because movement was control, and control was survival. He stopped now. The rain fell on his face, and he stood in it without moving, looking at Cha Seo-Ah unconscious on the wet asphalt, blood darkening the fabric of her nurse's uniform in a spreading stain that the rain was trying and failing to wash away. His men were shouting around him. Somewhere behind him, a car chase was beginning, engines growling into the distance. His mother was calling his name. He heard none of it. He heard nothing except the sound of something shifting inside his chest, not breaking, not yet, but moving, like tectonic plates that had been still for so long their motion registered as catastrophe. His bodyguard appeared at his shoulder. "Boss, the car is. Call an ambulance." His voice came out flat, controlled. The voice he used in negotiations, in interrogation rooms, in moments when emotion was a liability he could not afford. "Get my mother inside. Now." He walked forward. He crouched beside Cha Seo-Ah in the rain. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat and found a pulse. Weak, stuttering, but there. And the breath that left him then was the kind that a man releases when he didn't realize he'd been holding it. 3 weeks earlier, the world had been simple. 3 weeks earlier, Cha Seo-Ah had been arguing with a vending machine. It was 6:45 in the morning. The hospital corridors were beginning to fill with the particular exhausted energy of the early shift, and the machine on the 3rd floor had taken her last coins and given her nothing in return. She pressed the button again. Then she pressed it with the flat of her palm in the way that accomplished nothing but felt necessary. The machine hummed indifferently and kept its coffee. "Unbelievable," she said to nobody. "It does that on Tuesdays," said a voice from down the corridor. She turned. One of the orderlies, a young man named Dong Hyun who was perpetually cheerful in a way that Cha Seo-Ah both admired and found slightly exhausting at 6:45 in the morning, was pushing a linen cart past and gesturing at the machine with his chin. Something about the humidity. The coins get stuck in the mechanism. You have to press C4 and B2 at the same time while holding the refund button. Cha Seo-Ah stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I've lost a lot of money on Tuesdays." She followed his instructions. The machine shuddered, made a grinding sound that suggested deep internal conflict, and dispensed a cup of coffee that was approximately 70% hot water and 30% whatever the machine believed coffee to be. She accepted it gratefully anyway, because it was warm and it was hers, and at this point in the morning her standards were entirely practical. This was Cha Seo-Ah's life, and she had made a quiet peace with most of it. She was 28 years old. She had been a nurse for 4 years, and before that she had spent 3 years in nursing school working evening shifts at a convenience store to cover tuition that her scholarship didn't reach. She was good at her job in the particular way that went beyond technical competence. She remembered which patients were frightened of needles and which ones needed conversation more than medication, which family members needed to be told the truth slowly, and which ones needed it quickly. The hospital ran on people like her. It also underpaid people like her, which was a truth that she had learned to hold alongside her genuine love for the work without letting the two things destroy each other. Her father was in the long-term care unit on the 5th floor. She visited every morning before her shift and every evening after. His kidneys had been failing for 3 years, steadily and without drama, the way that serious illness often progressed, not in crises but in the slow accumulation of small worsening. The bills were in a folder at home that she had stopped opening because the numbers inside it had grown beyond the point where looking at them served any useful purpose. She knew what she owed. The men who called her phone every Tuesday and Thursday knew it too. She helped people who couldn't pay. She did this consistently and without announcing it, slipping a patient's meal supplement onto the department supply account, spending her breaks sitting with an elderly man whose family lived too far away to visit. She told herself it was professional habit. The truth was simpler than that. She simply could not watch suffering and do nothing. It was a design flaw, and she had stopped trying to correct it. She was finishing her morning rounds when she was assigned a new patient in room 412. The chart said, Kang Min-Jae, 63, post-surgical recovery, hip replacement, complicated by early-stage cardiac monitoring requirements. Private room. The admission paperwork had been processed through a corporate medical account rather than personal insurance, which was unusual but not unheard of for wealthy patients. There was a note at the bottom of the intake form in the handwriting of the admissions nurse who had processed her. Asterisk family requests complete privacy. No information to outside parties under any circumstances. Asterisk. Cha Seo-Ah read that note, filed it in the part of her brain where professional boundaries were stored, and knocked on the door of room 412. Come in, said a voice. Warm, slightly tired, carrying the particular authority of a woman who had spent decades being listened to. Madam Kang was sitting up in the bed with excellent posture that the hospital pillows were not designed to accommodate. She was elegant in the precise way that had nothing to do with what she was wearing, which was a standard hospital gown, and everything to do with how she inhabited space. Her hair was silver and neatly arranged. Her hands, resting on the blanket, wore no jewelry except for a single thin ring on her right hand that had clearly been there for many decades. She looked at Cha Seo-Ah with sharp, assessing eyes that softened almost immediately. You look tired, the older woman said, by way of greeting. Cha Seo-Ah smiled, setting her chart on the bedside table. Good morning to you too. I'm Nurse Cha. I'll be your primary care nurse this week. She began the standard checks, blood pressure cuff, pulse oximeter, a quick visual assessment of the surgical site dressing. How are you feeling this morning? Any pain at the incision site? Any tightness in your chest? Some stiffness? No real pain. Madam Kang watched her work. Do you always smile like that when you're tired? I always smile like this, Cha Seo-Ah said. It's a professional requirement. It doesn't look professional. It looks genuine. That's rarer. The older woman let her adjust the blood pressure cuff without protest, which in Cha Seo-Ah's experience was itself unusual. Most patients, particularly those accustomed to authority, had opinions about medical procedures being performed on them. My son thinks hospitals are places you come to die. I keep telling him that's a very limited perspective. How long have you been convincing him? 40 years, approximately. A pause. He remains unconvinced. Cha Seo-Ah laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. Madam Kang looked pleased with herself in the manner of someone who has correctly read a room and acted on it. They moved through the rest of the morning assessment in a comfortable rhythm that neither of them remarked upon, because some connections establish themselves quietly and don't require announcement. She had been attending to Madam Kang for 2 days before she met the son. She heard him first. Not loud. That was the thing she would remember afterward. His voice was not raised. It was low and level and carried the specific register of a person who never needed to shout because the alternative was worse. She was in the corridor outside room 412, updating the chart, when she heard it through the slightly open door. You don't need her every day. I like her every day. She's kind. The hospital provides round-the-clock staff. Min-Jae, the older woman's voice, patient and immovable. Sit down. You're making my blood pressure climb and your face is doing that thing. What thing? The thing where you think you're being reasonable and you're actually being frightening. A silence. Then the sound of a chair being moved. Cha Seo-Ah kept her eyes on the chart. She was not listening. She was professionally updating documentation in the immediate vicinity of a conversation that happened to be audible, which was an entirely different thing. She was still telling herself this when the door opened fully and Kang Min-Jae walked out. He was tall. She registered that first, because it changed the immediate geography of the corridor. Broad shoulders, dark clothing, expensive and understated. A face that would have been handsome if it weren't currently arranged into an expression that belonged on a man walking into a very unpleasant negotiation rather than a hospital hallway. He was perhaps 35. His eyes, when they found her, were the particular dark that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. He looked at her chart. He looked at her. His expression didn't change. "You're her nurse." "I am." She kept her voice level. Warm, but level. "Your mother is doing very well. Her recovery is progressing ahead of the expected timeline, which is, I know her condition." He said it without hostility, simply as a fact, establishing the boundary of what she needed to tell him. "She's comfortable?" "Very. She's excellent company." Something moved in his face, the ghost of something that might have been affection, gone before it fully arrived. He looked back at the door, then at her again. "She gets attached to people," he said quietly. It didn't sound like warmth. It sounded like a warning being carefully packaged as information. "Don't encourage it." Cha Seo-Ah considered him for a moment. "Your mother is a grown woman recovering from surgery in an unfamiliar place. Human connection is clinically beneficial to recovery outcomes." She held his gaze. "Encouraging it is part of my job." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Around them the corridor continued. Nurses passing, a trolley wheeling by, the hospital's indifferent, ordinary life. Then he turned and walked away, and Cha Seo-Ah became aware that she had been holding herself very slightly rigid and slowly released it. She looked down at her chart. Her handwriting, she noticed, had stopped midway through a sentence. She finished it. She moved on to her next patient. She did not think about the way his eyes had looked, like a man who had decided, a long time ago, that the safest place for other people was at a distance, and had been enforcing that decision ever since, and was very tired of how often it needed enforcing. She did not think about this at all. The coffee incident happened on a Thursday. Cha Seo-Ah had been balancing 3 things simultaneously: a patient chart tucked under her arm, a cup of coffee in her left hand, and a phone pressed between her ear and shoulder while the debt collection agency's automated system cycled through its menu options for the 4th time that morning. She was navigating the corner near the private wing elevator when she didn't see the man standing still in the corridor ahead of her, because still people were not something her peripheral vision was trained to flag as obstacles. She walked directly into Kang Min-Jae's bodyguard. The coffee went sideways. Most of it landed on the floor. A significant portion landed on the sleeve of the bodyguard's jacket. A small but meaningful amount reached the polished shoe of the man standing 2 feet behind him. The bodyguard went rigid. The 2 men flanking him went rigid. The entire small formation of expensive-looking men became collectively, silently catastrophic in the way of people who understood that minor accidents had consequences in their world. Cha Seo-Ah pulled the phone from her shoulder. "I'm so sorry." "Here, let me." She was already reaching for the small towel tucked into her uniform pocket, the one she carried for exactly the category of spills that hospital work routinely produced. She crouched and pressed it to the bodyguard's sleeve before he could process what was happening. "It's fine," the bodyguard said, in the voice of a man for whom nothing was fine. "It's not. Your jacket is. This is dry clean fabric, isn't it? The coffee is going to set if we don't." "Mississippi." The voice came from behind the bodyguards. She looked up. Min-Jae was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not anger. Not the cool dismissal she might have expected. Something more like a man who has been surprised by a very small, very ordinary thing and is uncertain what to do with the feeling. Behind him, a sound, Madam Kang's voice drifting through the open door of the lounge at the end of the corridor. "Is that Nurse Cha?" "Min-Jae, bring her in. I want her to see the flowers your aunt sent. They're absolutely hideous, and I need someone to agree with me." The bodyguard stepped aside. Min-Jae looked at Cha Seo-Ah for one more moment with that unreadable expression, then turned and walked toward the lounge. She understood, somehow, that this was an invitation by proxy and not a dismissal, so she followed. Madam Kang was sitting in the lounge armchair with the practiced comfort of a woman reclaiming territory. The flowers on the table beside her were, objectively, a great deal. An enormous arrangement of white lilies and orange birds of paradise, and what appeared to be decorative branches spray-painted gold. Cha Seo-Ah stopped in the doorway and looked at them. "Well," she said. "Yes," said Madam Kang, satisfied. "Exactly." Min-Jae sat in the chair nearest his mother with the particular stillness of a large animal that has chosen, for the moment, to be calm. He said nothing. He watched Seo-Ah interact with his mother the way he might watch a card player, assessing, cataloging, waiting for something that never came because there was nothing to find. She was simply kind. That was the disorienting part. Not performing kindness, not deploying it strategically. Simply being it. The way some people were simply tall or simply left-handed. When Madam Kang complained that the hospital tea tasted like warm disappointment, Seo-Ah laughed and agreed, and the next morning appeared with a small packet of the older woman's preferred green tea from the convenience store 2 streets over. When Madam Kang's physical therapist canceled due to illness, Seo-Ah spent her lunch break guiding her through the approved exercises herself, narrating each movement in a low, steady voice while holding the older woman's hand for balance. Min-Jae noticed all of it. He was a man whose survival had always depended on noticing. He also noticed the phone call she stepped away to take, always brief, always leaving her jaw slightly tighter when she returned. He noticed the way she checked her personal phone during breaks with the expression of someone expecting a bill rather than a message. He noticed that her lunch, on the 3 days he was present to observe it, consisted of whatever could be purchased from the vending machine with the smallest number of coins. He filed these observations away without examining why he was making them. On the 5th day, he found her in the corridor after visiting hours, sitting in one of the plastic chairs outside his mother's room with her head tipped back against the wall and her eyes closed. Not sleeping. Her hands were in her lap and her fingers were moving, doing some small repetitive thing that looked like counting. The overhead light was doing something unflattering to the exhaustion on her face that the daylight hours had hidden. He stopped. He should have kept walking. He had a car waiting. He had 3 calls he hadn't returned and a situation developing in the Southern District that required his attention before midnight. He had, in short, no reason to stop. He stopped anyway. "You're not on shift," he said. She opened her eyes without startling, which surprised him. Most people startled when he appeared unexpectedly. She simply looked at him with the direct, undefended attention of someone too tired to perform composure. "My father is on the 5th floor," she said. "I stay a little late on days when his numbers aren't good." She paused. Today his numbers weren't good. He said nothing. He was not a man practiced in the language of comfort. He had learned, young, that sentiment offered to the wrong people became a weapon they would eventually use. And so he had stopped offering it as a general rule. But she wasn't asking for comfort. She was simply answering his question, the way a person answers when they've decided the truth is less exhausting than a partial version of it. He sat down, not beside her, 2 chairs away, which maintained a distance that was simultaneously practical and deliberate. He said nothing. She said nothing. The corridor hummed around them. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady mechanical patience. After a while, she said, "You don't have to stay." "I know." Another silence. Then, "He used to run a small hardware business. My father. For 20 years. It was doing well enough, until it wasn't." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the ceiling, at the particular middle distance that people look at when they're describing things that still have edges. He used to say a business is like a body. If you take care of it, it takes care of you back. He took very good care of it. What happened to it? She was quiet for a moment. Things outside his control. She lowered her eyes from the ceiling and looked at her hands. He blames himself anyway. That's the thing about people who work hard. They always find a way to make failure personal. Min-Jae was looking at the opposite wall. "Some things are personal," he said. "And some things are just bad luck and worse timing." He turned his head slightly. She was still looking at her hands. "You believe that?" "I have to," she said simply. "Otherwise the world is just a place where good people suffer for bad reasons, and I can't do my job if I believe that." He looked at her for a moment longer than was appropriate, and then looked away. "People around me get hurt," he said. It came out as a statement of fact. He meant it as a warning. He meant it as, "Don't get attached, don't let my mother get attached, because the radius around me has historically been unkind to people who meant nothing to me, and it will be worse for people who do." She turned her head and looked at him with those clear, undefended eyes. Then maybe they need someone kind around them. He had no response to that. It wasn't the kind of line that invited argument. It was too simple, too direct. It bypassed the architecture of reasoning he was accustomed to and landed somewhere prior to logic. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. "Get some rest," he said. The way he said it, quiet, almost careful, surprised him slightly. He walked away. He didn't look back. He had trained himself years ago not to look back, because men in his position who looked back eventually found the looking back was what destroyed them. He didn't look back, but in the elevator, going down, he stood with his hands in his pockets and heard the line again with the involuntary clarity of something that had already decided to stay. Then maybe they need someone kind around them. The doors opened. His driver was waiting. The city outside was doing what the city always did, indifferent, enormous, continuing, and Min-Jae walked out into it and put the conversation away in the same internal place. He put everything that he couldn't afford to examine closely. He was very good at this. He had been doing it for 20 years. It was becoming, for the first time in a long time, difficult. In a building across the city, in an office that smelled of cigarette smoke and ambition, a man named Park Sung-joon was looking at photographs. Hospital exterior. Entrance. Parking lot. A woman in a white uniform. An older woman being helped toward a car. He set the photographs down and poured himself a drink. The boss's mother, his lieutenant said. Every Tuesday and Thursday. Same time. Same exit. Park Sung-joon looked at the photograph of the nurse for a moment. Then he picked up the one of Madam Kang. He tapped it once against the desk, thinking. Kang Min-Jae built his empire on one principle, he said. Keep everything that matters out of reach. He set the photograph down. Find out what's in reach now. The weeks that followed moved the way certain things move. Slowly enough that each individual day felt ordinary. Quickly enough that looking back, the distance covered was startling. Madam Kang's recovery progressed well. Her physiotherapy sessions grew longer. Her color improved. She began requesting specific teas and holding quiet opinions about the hospital menu and asking Cha Seo-Ah questions that had nothing to do with nursing, where she had grown up, whether she liked music, what she thought about rain. Cha Seo-Ah answered all of them honestly, because Madam Kang asked with the kind of genuine interest that made evasion feel rude. Min-Jae visited every other day, sometimes daily. He told himself this was because his mother's condition warranted monitoring. He was a man who had, over the years, told himself many things with great conviction. He watched Cha Seo-Ah help his mother walk the length of the corridor and back, slow, careful circuits, Madam Kang's hand on Cha Seo-Ah's arm. Both of them talking in low voices that occasionally broke into laughter. He could hear from the nurse's station, where he stood pretending to check his phone. He watched Cha Seo-Ah crouch beside his mother's chair to adjust the brace on her knee, doing it with a focused, unhurried attention that made the gesture feel like something more than clinical procedure. He watched his mother watch Cha Seo-Ah with the particular expression she had once reserved for things she loved without reservation. The expression made something tighten in his chest. Not jealousy, nothing so simple. Something more like fear wearing unfamiliar clothes. She reminds me of your grandmother, Madam Kang said one afternoon when Cha Seo-Ah had stepped out. That quality of being entirely present. Most people are somewhere else while they're with you. She's always here. She's doing her job, Min-Jae said. His mother looked at him with the patience of a woman who had been seeing through him for 35 years. Min-Jae, I love you, but you are sometimes spectacularly wrong. He said nothing. He looked at the door Cha Seo-Ah had walked through. He looked at his hands. Don't, his mother said quietly. Not harshly, just clearly, the way she said things when she wanted him to understand that she was serious. Don't push her away before something has even begun. I know why you do it. I know it comes from a place of trying to protect. But there are some things that protection cannot reach, and those are usually the things worth having. People who are close to me get hurt, he said. The same line he had said to Cha Seo-Ah in the corridor. It was his oldest argument. He had been making it for so long it had worn grooves in him. And people who are far from you are also hurt, his mother said. Because you carry your world with you, Min-Jae. Distance isn't protection. It's just loneliness with a tactical justification. He left shortly after. He walked to his car in the hospital parking lot and sat in the back seat for longer than he needed to before telling his driver to go. The city moved past the windows and he looked at it without seeing it. And somewhere in the long silence of the drive, he had the unsettling awareness that his mother was almost certainly right, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with that. Cha Seo-Ah, meanwhile, was learning him in the way you learn a place you visit often, not by studying it deliberately, but by accumulating small details until a shape emerged. She learned that he took his coffee without anything and drank it standing up. She learned that when his phone rang and he chose not to answer it, His jaw tightened on the right side in a way that was probably invisible to people not trained to monitor physical tension. She learned that he always sat in the chair nearest his mother's door, not nearest her bed. And she had thought at first this was coldness until she understood it was positioning. He sat where he could see the entrance. Always. Because he was always the first line between his mother and whatever came through the door. She learned that he was not a cold man. He was a careful one. There was a difference, and it was significant. She did not let herself examine why the difference mattered to her. What she did let herself examine, because it arrived too suddenly for avoidance, was the afternoon she found him in the supply corridor near the pharmacy, not doing anything, just standing with his back against the wall and his eyes closed. His jacket was off. The sleeves of his shirt were pushed to his elbows. She could see, along his forearm and disappearing beneath the fabric, the pale geography of old scars, the kind that had healed years ago and were simply part of him now, the way a landscape carries evidence of old weather. She should have kept walking. She knew that. Instead, she stopped. He opened his eyes without moving. She didn't apologize for seeing. She just said quietly, "Does it hurt?" Old injuries can ache in cold weather. He looked at her for a moment. "No. There's a warming compress in the supply room. It would help with any stiffness." "I said it doesn't hurt." "I know what you said." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you what would help anyway." Something shifted in his expression, not softening. Exactly, but a particular quality of resistance quietly leaving. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he can't categorize and has stopped trying to dismiss. She reached past him. He didn't move, which meant she was closer than was strictly professional for a moment, and opened the supply room door and took out a compress and held it out. He took it. His fingers brushed hers in the transfer. Neither of them remarked on it. "Thank you," he said, like the words were in a language he was relearning. "You're welcome," she said, like it was the easiest thing in the world. That night, Seo-Ah sat on the floor of her small apartment with her back against the couch and her father's latest medical report in her hands and let herself feel, for exactly 10 minutes, everything she couldn't afford to feel during the day. The numbers on the report, the number in her bank account, the fact that she had eaten half a meal because the other half was in a container in the hospital refrigerator for a patient who had mentioned he was hungry after his family left. The sound of her phone ringing at 8 in the evening and the automated voice that greeted her. She cried for approximately 6 of her 10 minutes. Then she washed her face. Then she made rice and ate it and prepared her bag for the morning. This was her discipline, not the absence of feeling but the management of it. Feel it, then set it down, then continue. Her mother had taught her this before she died, when Seo-Ah was 15 and the world was first demonstrating its full range of difficulty. Asterisk, you don't have to be strong, her mother had said. Asterisk, you just have to keep going. Those are different things. She kept going. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that 3 floors above her father's room, in a conversation she wasn't present for, Min-Jae had asked his financial manager a single quiet question about the outstanding medical debt attached to a patient named Cha Byung-soo, and the financial manager, who had worked for Min-Jae for 11 years and had learned to execute requests without seeking explanations, had made a note and said nothing further. And what neither of them knew, Seo-Ah in her small apartment, Min-Jae in the back seat of his car, was that Park Sung-joon had finished his planning and the photographs on his desk had been replaced by a diagram, and the diagram had dates on it, and the earliest date was circled, and it was less than a week away. The hospital parking lot. Tuesday night. After the physiotherapy session, he had learned what was in reach. Now he intended to use it. The shooting changed everything in the way that singular moments do. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like a bone that snaps clean. Seo-Ah woke in a room that was not a hospital. She understood this before she opened her eyes, because the sounds were wrong. No monitors. No distant intercom. No squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. What she heard instead was the low, even sound of climate-controlled air and, somewhere further away, the muffled exchange of male voices speaking in the clipped shorthand of men who worked together in dangerous circumstances. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was high and cream-colored and lit by recessed lighting that was too warm and too deliberate to belong to any medical facility she had ever worked in. She turned her head carefully. The movement sent a firm, clarifying pain through her left shoulder and upper chest that told her exactly where she was injured and approximately how recently. and 4 line ran from her arm to a drip stand beside the bed. The dressing on her shoulder was clean and professionally applied. Whoever had treated her knew what they were doing. The room was large. The furniture was dark wood and expensive. Heavy curtains covered a window through which thin lines of daylight pressed at the edges. On the chair in the corner, neatly folded, was a set of clean clothes that were not hers. She sat up slowly, which was a mistake, and then sat up anyway, because lying down while disoriented in an unfamiliar room felt more dangerous than the pain. The door opened before she had finished deciding what to do. Min-Jae walked in. He was wearing different clothes from the night of the shooting: dark shirt, dark trousers, the kind of effortless formality that suggested he had never once in his adult life worn anything casual. He looked at her sitting upright, and something moved rapidly across his face. Relief, she thought, though on his face it arrived and departed so quickly she couldn't be entirely certain. And then his expression settled back into the controlled neutrality she had come to recognize as his default. "You should be lying down," he said. "Where am I?" "Somewhere safe." That's not an answer. It's the relevant part of the answer. He crossed the room and stood at what she had begun to think of as his characteristic distance, close enough to speak at normal volume, far enough to maintain the boundary he carried everywhere with him like a second jacket. "The doctor has been here twice. The bullet was removed. No major vessel damage. You'll need 4 to 6 weeks of recovery." She absorbed this. "Your mother? Unharmed. She's here." Here meaning my residence. He said it without elaboration, as though the fact of her being in his home was a logistical detail rather than the significant thing it obviously was. "You were the target of an organized attack. Returning you to your apartment would have been irresponsible." Seo-Ah looked at him steadily. The pain in her shoulder was a persistent, grounding presence, and she was grateful for it in the way you're sometimes grateful for things that keep you anchored to the practical. "I need to get back to the hospital. My patients. Your supervisor has been informed you require medical leave. It's been handled. My father is being attended to. I've arranged additional care." He paused, just slightly. His account has also been settled. The silence that followed was a particular quality of silence, the kind that has weight. "What do you mean settled?" she said. "The outstanding balance. Medical bills. The debt collection accounts." He was looking at the middle distance, not at her face, which told her more than looking at her would have. "It's done." She stared at him. The 4 line shifted as her hand tightened on the blanket. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No, I don't want," she stopped, steadied herself. "I don't want to owe you anything. I especially don't want to owe you something I didn't agree to." He looked at her then. "You took a bullet for my mother. That wasn't a transaction. I know what it was." His voice was quiet. The particular quiet of a man choosing words with care because the careless versions would say too much. "I'm not asking you to consider it a transaction either, but I won't apologize for it." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was something behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Not the cool assessment she had first seen in the hospital corridor, but something rawer than that, something that hadn't fully been put away. She thought about the parking lot. She thought about what it must have looked like from where he was standing, arriving to find his mother alive and the woman who had been caring for her bleeding on the wet asphalt. "How long were you outside my room?" she asked. "At the hospital, before they moved me here." A pause. "That's not relevant." "It is to me." He looked away. "All night," he said, like admitting a debt. She didn't say anything. She lay back against the pillow carefully, managing the pain with the practiced economy of a nurse who had observed too much suffering to be theatrical about her own. She stared at the ceiling. He remained standing where he was, which she was beginning to understand was what he did when he didn't know what else to do. He stood, and he stayed, and he said nothing, and in his world that apparently constituted presence. The days that followed were strange. Not unpleasant. Strange. The mansion, because it was a mansion, she accepted this by the second day, operated on its own rhythms. Armed men moved through it with the casual purposefulness of staff in any large household, except that their jobs involved perimeter checks rather than housekeeping. Madam Kang appeared at Seo-Ah's door every morning at 9 with tea and strong opinions about what Seo-Ah should eat for breakfast. The doctor visited daily. Nobody asked her questions she couldn't answer. On the third day, she woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of something cooking. She found Min-Jae in the kitchen. He was standing at the stove with his sleeves rolled up, stirring something in a pot with the focused, slightly uncertain manner of a man who has learned a specific skill through repetition rather than instinct. He heard her come in and didn't look up. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I was." She came to the kitchen island and sat on one of the stools, pulling her cardigan tighter. The kitchen was warm. The rest of the house was very quiet. "What are you making?" "Porridge." A pause. "The doctor said your stomach can't manage anything with spice yet. The cook doesn't come until 6. He still wasn't looking at her. "You need to eat." She watched him stir the porridge. The domestic incongruity of it. This man, in this kitchen, in the middle of the night, was so complete that she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "I know. You keep doing things you don't have to do." He set the spoon down and looked at her across the kitchen island. In the low light, with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled back and the scars visible on his forearms, he looked less like the man she had first seen in the hospital corridor and more like something underneath that man, something older and more tired and more honest. "Why did you save her?" he asked. The question he had been carrying since the parking lot. She could hear the weight of it. She considered the question seriously. Not the easy answer, because it was the right thing, because she couldn't not, but the true one. "Because someone would cry if she died," she said. "You would cry? And I've watched you try very hard not to need anything for long enough to know that losing her would." She stopped. "Some losses you don't come back from. I didn't want that for you." He looked at her for a long time. The porridge bubbled quietly on the stove. "You were thinking about me," he said slowly, "while you were stepping in front of a bullet. You were thinking about me. I was thinking about the look on your face if you lost her." She held his gaze. "I've seen that look in my work. I spend a lot of effort trying to prevent it." He turned back to the stove. She couldn't see his expression. His shoulders were very still in the way of a person absorbing something they weren't prepared for. He served the porridge. He placed it in front of her without ceremony. He leaned against the counter across from her with his arms folded and watched her eat with the quiet attention of a man who has decided this is the most important thing happening in the world right now. Neither of them spoke. The house was silent around them. Outside, somewhere in the dark, his men walked their perimeter. It was the most peaceful Cha Seo-Ah had felt in months. She didn't examine that either. The truth arrived the way difficult truths often do, not as a revelation, but as a slow, sickening recognition of something that had been present all along, waiting for the right light. Cha Seo-Ah found the documents by accident. She had been looking for a pen. 3 weeks into her recovery, mobile enough to move carefully through the house, she had taken to spending her afternoons in the study that Madam Kang used for correspondence. A comfortable room lined with books and afternoon light, where the older woman held court from a wide armchair and complained pleasantly about everything. Madam Kang had stepped out to take a call. Cha Seo-Ah had reached across the desk for a pen and knocked a folder to the floor, and when she bent to gather its scattered contents, her eyes found a name that stopped her hands completely. Cha Byung-soo Hardware and Supply. Dissolution of Business Assets, 2019. She picked up the page. Then the next one. Then the one beneath that. The story assembled itself in her hands with the terrible efficiency of things that have always been true. A business loan. A larger company. A subsidiary, several corporate layers removed from the name Kang, but connected, unmistakably connected, that had acquired the building Cha Byung-soo Hardware leased, then tripled the rent within 6 months, then declined to renew the lease at any price. A coordinated pressure that had no single illegal act within it, but was constructed, from foundation to roof, as a mechanism for removing small businesses from a block that a larger interest wanted cleared. Her father's business. Her father's 20 years. The hardware store she had grown up in, where she had done homework behind the counter and learned the names of tools before she learned multiplication tables. Gone because someone had decided the land was more valuable without it, and the someone was connected, by documented corporate threads, to the organization that Min-Jae led. She sat in the chair for a long time without moving. When Madam Kang returned, she found Cha Seo-Ah standing at the window with her back to the room and the documents in her hand. And the older woman read the situation with the accuracy of someone who has lived long enough to recognize the specific stillness of a person whose world has just rearranged itself. "Cha Seo-Ah," she said quietly. "Did you know?" Cha Seo-Ah's voice was steady. She had spent years learning to keep it steady. "About my father's business." A long pause. "No, not until recently." When Min-Jae was looking into your background, for security purposes, after the shooting, it came up. He found it before you did. Another pause. He's been trying to find a way to tell you. She turned. Her eyes were dry. She was past the stage where tears were useful. He knew, and he cleared my father's debts anyway. Without telling me. Without giving me the choice of whether I wanted anything from him at all. He didn't know how to. I know. She set the documents on the desk. Her hands were very careful with them, which was its own kind of feeling. I know he didn't know how. That's not the point. She looked at Madam Kang. At this woman she had genuinely come to love, which was itself a complicated thing to be holding right now. I need some time. I'm sorry. She left the following morning. Min-Jae was in the corridor when she came downstairs with her bag. He looked at her face and then at the bag, and something in his expression closed. The way a room closes when a window shuts. Not slammed, just sealed. The warmth going internal. You found out, he said. You knew for 2 weeks. Yes. And you said nothing. I was going to. When? She looked at him directly. The question wasn't angry. It was exhausted, which was worse. When the debt was paid off and the evidence was tidied away, and I had no way to be angry without seeming ungrateful. When you had constructed the situation so that the only reasonable response was. She stopped. I'm not a problem to be managed, Min-Jae. I know that. Then you should have told me. Her voice broke on the last word. Just slightly. Just enough to be audible. And she saw it hit him the way the truth sometimes hits people who have been trying to do right things wrongly. My father lost everything. And I have been sitting in your house eating your porridge, and she pressed her lips together. I need to go. He stepped aside. He did it immediately, without argument, which she understood was its own kind of respect. She walked past him. At the door she stopped, not turning. I don't think you're a bad person, she said quietly. I think you've spent so long in a world where caring about someone means controlling what they know that you've forgotten those are different things. A pause. Your mother didn't raise that. You learned it somewhere else. She left. He stood in the corridor and did not move for a long time. What happened next happened fast, the way disasters do when they have been building patiently in the background while everyone's attention was directed elsewhere. Min-Jae discovered, through channels that cost him 2 days and one very honest conversation with his most loyal lieutenant, that the hospital attack had not come from Park Sung-joon alone. It had been enabled from inside. Information about his mother's schedule, her exit route, the shift patterns of the nurses on her floor, all of it passed outward by someone who ate at Min-Jae's table and understood that the organization's growing instability had a single, identifiable cause. The traitor's name was Han Ju-won. 15 years of service. A man Min-Jae had trusted with things he trusted almost nobody with. The reason, in Han Ju-won's own words, delivered to Min-Jae's face in a room from which there was no comfortable exit. You are becoming a man in love. Men in love make decisions. Decisions have consequences. I was protecting the organization. Min-Jae had the particular, icy clarity that sometimes replaces emotion when emotion would be too expensive. You tried to kill my mother, he said. I tried to remove the vulnerability. Han Ju-won looked at him steadily. She was never the target. The nurse was. Eliminate the attachment. Eliminate the weakness. Where is she? Min-Jae said. Past tense was already forming in his mind before the answer arrived. It arrived as a phone call. Unknown number. A voice he didn't recognize. And then behind it, briefly, a sound he did. Cha Seo-Ah. Not crying. Not screaming. Just saying his name once in the flat, clear tone of someone communicating a situation rather than asking for rescue. She was too composed. That was how he knew she was genuinely frightened. The message that followed was brief. A boss without weakness survives. A man in love dies. Warehouse District, Mapo, 2 hours. He went alone. His backup was 12 minutes behind him because he did not wait. And he did not wait because 2 hours was already 40 minutes gone by the time the call ended, and every minute of arithmetic pointed in the same direction. He drove himself for the first time in 4 years. He ran 2 red lights. He was through the warehouse door before his phone rang with his lieutenant asking where he was. She was in the back of the warehouse, zip-tied to a chair with a cut above her eyebrow that had bled down the side of her face and dried there. She looked up when he came in and did the thing that broke whatever was left of his composure. She looked relieved. Not for herself. She looked relieved to see that he was unharmed. You came alone, she said. You absolute. Are you hurt? My head. It's superficial. Min-Jae, there are 4 of them there. What followed was not clean or cinematic. It was loud and close and brutal, and he took a knife across his ribs on the left side in the 3rd minute, because he was focused on the man moving toward Seo-Ah rather than the man moving toward him. He put that man down and kept moving. By the time his backup arrived, there were 2 men unconscious, 1 restrained, and 1 gone through a back exit who would be found later by people with patience Min-Jae currently didn't have. He was working on the zip ties when the last shot came through the broken window. He turned. He covered her with his body without making a decision about it, the way she had covered Madam Kang in the rain. Not bravery in the conscious sense, simply the absolute impossibility of doing otherwise. The bullet caught him high in the chest. He stayed upright for approximately 4 seconds. Then he sat down, heavily, against the wall. Seo-Ah was free now. His men had the ties cut, and she was beside him immediately with her hands on his face and her training overriding her terror in the clean, decisive way that real training does. Stay with me, she said. Min-Jae, eyes on me. Stay with me. He looked at her. His vision was doing complicated things. But she was clear. You said, he started. Don't talk. Someone would cry, he said. Quietly. The ghost of something that on another day, in another condition, might have been a smile. If you died, I'd cry. He found her hand without looking for it. I was trying to become someone worthy of your kindness. He exhaled, still trying. She was crying. She hadn't realized she'd started. You don't get to say that and then die on a warehouse floor. Those are the rules. I'm a medical professional, and those are the rules. His men were already calling for transport. She was already applying pressure, her hands certain and steady despite everything. Because she had been trained for exactly this, and also because falling apart would not help him, and she refused to do anything that would not help him. I'm angry at you, she said, pressing down. I'm still angry. Just so you know. I know, he said faintly. Good. She pressed harder. He didn't flinch. Don't you dare close your eyes. He didn't. Months later, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, flowers arrived at the small clinic on the quiet street in Mapo that had been funded anonymously and had become, in the months since it opened, the kind of place where people who had nowhere else to go came first. White chrysanthemums. Madam Kang's favorite. The note inside was in handwriting she recognized, deliberate, slightly formal. The handwriting of a man who had learned to express care in words because action had been his only language for too long. You once told me kindness saves people. I'm trying to become someone worthy of yours. I think I'm closer than I was. I'm not close enough yet, but I'm trying. Seo-Ah read it twice. She set it on the desk beside the flowers. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment and looked at the ceiling with the wet, specific expression of a person feeling something too large for the available space. Then she looked out the window. Across the street, half in the shadow of a doorway, a man in a dark jacket was watching the clinic with an expression she had cataloged carefully enough over enough mornings to read from a distance. Not the controlled neutrality of his default, not the cold assessment of his public face, but something quieter and less defended than either of those. Something that looked, from here, remarkably like hope. He saw her see him. He didn't disappear. He stood there for one long moment, visible, unhidden, present, which was, for him, the most significant thing he knew how to offer. Then he turned and walked slowly down the street, and she watched him go with her hand still pressed to her mouth, and the flowers bright on the desk beside her. And the city continued around them both, indifferent and enormous and entirely unaware that something cold had quietly, painstakingly, become warm. Sometimes even the coldest hearts are waiting for one person brave enough to bleed for them.